held her down in the farmhouse she'd called home, scissors flashing in the dim light as her long hair fell like dark rain onto the wooden floor. But cutting her hair wasn't enough. They needed her unrecognizable, unidentifiable, erased. So they painted her face with a black mixture that burned like liquid fire, staining her skin with scars that would mark her forever. Not from any accident, but from the desperate cruelty of family trying to save themselves. Katerina had carried a secret for 3 years, a memory of screams and splintering wood and a queen's carriage plummeting into a ravine while she stood frozen in the forest, too terrified to cry out. She thought her silence had buried the truth. She was wrong. When the king arrived at her door, his grief-shadowed eyes searching for answers about his wife's death, Katerina's carefully constructed lies began to crumble. But she wasn't the only one hiding secrets. Someone had murdered the queen deliberately, systematically, as part of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power. And now that same conspiracy knew Katerina existed, the one witness who could destroy everything they'd built on blood and deception. As assassins closed in and allies revealed themselves as enemies, Katerina faced an impossible choice: remain silent and survive, or speak the truth and risk losing everything, including the broken king who'd somehow become the only person she could trust. But the king had secrets too, and when he looked at Katerina's scarred face and said those 5 words that would change both their lives forever, "You come with me," neither of them knew that the real conspiracy was far more devastating than murder. Because sometimes the people you trust most are the ones holding the knife. And sometimes the only way to find justice for the dead is to risk joining them. The letter burned in Katerina's trembling hands like a confession she should have made 3 years ago. Ink blurred where her tears had fallen during the writing, each smudged word a piece of the truth that lived like shattered glass inside her chest. She had written it 17 times over the past months, 17 attempts to put into words the moment that divided her life into before and after. The moment she watched Queen Eleanor's carriage plummet into the ravine and did nothing, said nothing, became nothing but a coward who ran. Her fingers traced the last line she'd written. "I saw her die, and I was too afraid to scream." The words looked smaller on parchment than they felt carved into her soul. Outside the window of the cramped farmhouse attic where she slept, the fields of her cousin's estate stretched toward the forest where it happened. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago. Katerina knew the exact count, because she marked each sunrise as another day of stealing breath while the queen's children grew up motherless. She was 16 then, just a girl gathering medicinal herbs her grandmother had taught her to identify. Now 19, she barely recognized the reflection that stared back from the cracked mirror each morning. Hollow eyes that had witnessed death, hands that had clutched herbs instead of crying out a warning, a body that worked itself to exhaustion trying to outrun guilt. The door crashed open without warning. Katerina's heart seized as her cousin Marcus filled the doorway, his face twisted with something between fury and terror. Behind him, his wife Helena's sharp features were pale as winter frost. In Marcus's hand was an opened letter, not the one Katerina held. This one was older, crumpled, the seal broken. Her stomach dropped like a stone into dark water. That letter, the first one she'd written and hidden under the loose floorboard beneath her sleeping mat, the one she thought no one would ever find. 3 years. Marcus's voice came out strangled, each word costing him something. 3 years you've carried this poison in your mouth and said nothing. To us? Helena's eyes darted to the window, then back to Katerina, calculating and cold. Do you understand what you've done to this family? What you've made us complicit in? Katerina's throat closed. She tried to speak, to explain that she'd never meant to tell anyone, that the letters were just her way of bleeding out the guilt in private. But Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her arm with bruising force. The king's investigators have been questioning villagers for months. His breath came in sharp bursts against her face. They're looking for witnesses. Anyone who saw anything that day. Anyone who might have information about the queen's death. I didn't see anyone tamper with the carriage. Katerina managed, her voice barely a whisper. It was an accident. The wheel just... You think that matters? Helena hissed, moving closer. You think the king will care about the difference between seeing a murder and seeing an accident you didn't report? You think he'll distinguish between you and us when you've lived under our roof all this time? The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in. Katerina's pulse hammered in her ears so loud she almost missed Helena's next words. They execute entire households for treason, entire families for withholding information about crimes against the crown. Helena's perfectly manicured hand, so different from Katerina's work-roughened fingers, reached out and grabbed a fistful of Katerina's long, dark hair. Do you know what they'll do to our children? To my sons? Tears streamed down Katerina's face now, hot and helpless. I'll go to the king myself. I'll tell him you knew nothing. I'll confess everything and doom us all when he asks why we didn't come forward the moment we learned our cousin was a witness. Marcus's laugh was bitter and brittle. You stupid, stupid girl. Your confession becomes our death warrant. Helena released Katerina's hair and stepped back, her expression shifting into something calculated and cruel. We have to protect ourselves. Make sure that if the king's men come here, they find nothing. No witness. No one who could have seen anything. Ice flooded Katerina's veins. What are you saying? We're not murderers, Marcus said, but his eyes said he was trying to convince himself as much as her. But we can make certain that if anyone asks, they'll see you're just a scarred farm girl who couldn't possibly be the witness they're looking for. Helena was already moving toward the door. Bring her downstairs and fetch the shears from the barn, the sharp ones. Katerina's legs went weak. She tried to pull away from Marcus's grip, but he was stronger, always had been. Please, please, there has to be another way. I'll burn the letters. I'll swear on anything holy that... Swear on your silence. Helena's voice floated back from the hallway, each word a nail in a coffin. Like you've kept silent for 3 years, while the whole kingdom mourned. Your word means nothing, cousin. But your face can be changed. Your appearance altered enough that no investigator would ever believe you're the girl who was in those woods that day. They dragged her down the narrow stairs, her feet catching on steps she'd climbed 1,000 times. The main room of the farmhouse, where she'd eaten meals, mended clothes, pretended life was normal, had been transformed. Helena had already gathered what they needed, the shearing scissors that gleamed like sue, silver promises of pain, and something worse. A ceramic bowl filled with thick black substance that smelled of char and oil and permanence. This will hurt less if you don't fight, Marcus said, but his voice shook. Somewhere beneath the fear that drove him, Katerina heard a trace of the cousin who used to let her steal extra bread as a child. That person was drowning now, pulled under by the survival instinct that makes people capable of terrible things. Helena grabbed Katerina's hair again, pulling her head back. The first cut of the shears sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room. Long, dark strands fell like severed pieces of who she used to be. Katerina closed her eyes, but that made it worse. Behind her lids, she saw the queen's carriage again, teetering on the edge before the fall. Heard the screams she should have answered with her own. Hold her still, Helena commanded. The mixture needs to go on evenly, or it won't take properly. The substance was cold when it first touched her skin, spread across her cheeks, her forehead, down her neck. Then the burning started. Not the sharp pain of a cut, but something deeper, more insidious. Like her skin was being slowly erased, transformed into something unrecognizable. Katerina bit her lip until she tasted blood, refusing to scream, refusing to give them that. 3 days, Helena said clinically, studying her work. Keep it on for 3 days and nights. By then, it will have stained deep enough to look like burn. Scars, old ones, the kind that would make anyone believe you've been disfigured for years, not days. Through the haze of pain and shame, Katerina heard horses approaching. Multiple riders, moving fast. Marcus heard them too. His face went gray as ash. The king's men, he breathed. They're here. They're actually here. Helena's hands, still covered in the black mixture, began to shake. We're too late. They'll see. They'll know what we've done. But the riders passed the farmhouse without, stopping, their hoofbeats fading toward the main road. Just travelers, not investigators. Not yet. Marcus exhaled slowly, then looked at Katerina with something that might have been guilt before fear devoured it. You stay in the root cellar until the stain sets. Tell anyone who asks that you were burned in a kitchen fire years ago. You remember nothing about the Queen's death. You were nowhere near those woods. Do you understand? Katerina nodded, because what else could she do? Her face was on fire. Her shorn hair lay scattered like accusations across the floor. And the truth, the one thing she'd tried to write down and release, had become the weapon that destroyed what little remained of her life. As Marcus led her toward the cellar door, Katerina caught her reflection in the polished copper pot hanging by the hearth. Black substance covered her face like a grotesque mask, gaps showing where her natural skin still fought to exist beneath the stain. She looked like something half-formed, caught between human and shadow, and somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats sounded again. Closer this time, deliberate. The root cellar smelled of earth and decay, of potatoes going soft in the darkness, and the particular dampness that settled into stone walls built a generation ago. Katerina sat on the dirt floor with her knees pulled to her chest, the black mixture on her face having dried into a tight, cracking mask that pulled at her skin with every breath. 3 days, Helena had said. 3 days of hiding in this tomb while her face transformed into a lie. Above her, footsteps crossed and recrossed the farmhouse floor. Voices, some she recognized, others foreign and carrying the sharp consonants of the capital city, filtered through the floorboards like fragments of a conversation that would determine whether she lived or died. Marcus was speaking, his tone carefully measured, the voice he used when haggling over grain prices at market. But there was something underneath it now, a tremor that even his best performance couldn't quite hide. My household is modest, my lord, Marcus was saying. Just myself, my wife, our 2 sons, and my cousin who helps with the farm work. We heard about the Queen's death, of course. Terrible tragedy. The whole kingdom mourned. A different voice responded, deeper, rougher around the edges like a blade that had seen use. Your cousin, the one who works the fields. Where is she now? Katerina's heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity before slamming back into rhythm, each pulse painful against her ribs, her hands pressed flat against the cool earth beneath her, grounding her, keeping her from screaming. In the village, Helena's voice joined in, smooth as honey over poison. Delivering preserved fruits to the monastery. She goes every week. Very devout girl, my husband's cousin. Simple, really. Keeps to herself. The lie was so practiced, so perfect, that Katerina almost believed it herself. But then she heard something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. We're looking for a young woman, approximately 19 years old, who was seen gathering herbs in the forest near the ravine on the day Queen Eleanor died. The rough voice paused, and Katerina could imagine the investigator's eyes scanning the room, looking for tells, for cracks in the story. Several villagers mentioned seeing someone matching that description. Dark hair, slender build, often carried a woven basket. Silence. Stretched above her like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Then Marcus laughed, and it sounded almost genuine. Half the girls in the region fit that description, my lord, and many gather herbs. My cousin did years ago, before the accident. Accident? The investigator's interest sharpened like a hound catching a scent. Kitchen fire, Helena supplied quickly. 4 years ago. She was badly burned. Her face was scarred terribly. We've kept her close since then, given her work that doesn't require her to be seen much. Charity, really, since no man would have her now. 4 years ago. The lie added a year to push the timeline safely before the Queen's death, making it impossible for Katerina to be the witness they sought. The calculation was brilliant and damning all at once. I'd like to see her, the investigator said, when she returns from the village. Of course, my lord. Marcus's voice held just the right note of cooperative innocence. Though I warn you, The scarring is quite severe. She's sensitive about it, rarely speaks to strangers. More footsteps above, moving toward the door. Then they stopped. Katerina held her breath so completely that spots began to dance at the edges of her vision. These tracks outside. A new voice spoke, younger, higher, educated in the precise diction of someone trained in the royal courts. Fresh wagon ruts. You said your cousin took the cart to the village? No, my lord. Marcus didn't miss a beat. My eldest son took it this morning to collect supplies from the mill. My cousin walks, always has. Says it clears her mind. The young voice hummed, unconvinced but unable to find purchase in the explanation. We'll be staying at the inn in the village for the next week, questioning everyone in the area. If your cousin remembers anything at all, about that day 3 years ago, it would be in everyone's best interest for her to come forward. Of course, my lord, we're loyal subjects of the crown. If we knew anything that could help, we would have come forward immediately. The words hung in the air like smoke, obscuring truth and lies until they became indistinguishable. Finally, the footsteps retreated. Horses were mounted, leather creaked, hooves struck packed earth. But they didn't leave, not right away. Katerina could feel them lingering, the weight of their suspicion pressing down through the floorboards like a physical thing. Check the outbuildings, the rough voice commanded. The barn, the storage sheds. I want to see everything. Terror seized Katerina's chest in a grip so tight she thought her ribs might crack. They would search, they would be thorough. And the root cellar. The root cellar had an exterior door that locked from the outside. But the interior entrance, the one directly above her head, had only a thin wooden panel and a latch that could be lifted from below if someone knew where to press. Above her, Helena's footsteps crossed the floor deliberately, then paused. Directly over the cellar entrance, something heavy was dragged across the boards. A chest, maybe, or a piece of furniture, blocking the door, hiding the seam in the floor. "My son's toys!" Helena called out, her voice carrying toward the door. "They leave things everywhere. Let me clear a path for you, my lords." The scraping continued, more furniture moving, creating the illusion of a cluttered but innocent household being tidied for important visitors. Each sound was a thread in the web Helena was weaving, and Katerina sat at the center of it, trapped and trembling. Then the exterior cellar door rattled. Someone was testing it, pulling at the rusted lock. Katerina pressed herself against the far wall as if the stones could swallow her whole. Through the gaps around the doorframe, she could see daylight, could see the shadow of a man's boots as he examined the entrance. "Locked," the young voice observed. "Key?" "Of course." Marcus's voice, closer now, approaching. "We keep the winter stores down there. Can't have animals getting in. Let me just..." The scrape of metal on metal, the lock turning. The door began to open, sunlight spilling into the darkness like an accusation. Katerina's mind went blank with panic. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. In seconds they would see her, would see the fresh black stain on her face, would know immediately that something was desperately wrong. All of Helena's careful lies would collapse like the Queen's carriage had. Collapsed, and this time there would be no running away. But Marcus was already speaking, his voice loud and casual. "Careful on the steps, my lord. They're quite old and uneven. My grandfather built this cellar, and he was more concerned with depth than safety. Here, let me go first and light the lamp. Wouldn't want you to trip in the dark." He descended into the cellar, his body blocking the doorway, his bulk filling the entrance. In his hand was a lamp, but he held it low, angling the light toward the bins of stored vegetables on the right side of the cellar, away from where Katerina sat frozen against the left wall, cloaked in shadows. "As you can see," Marcus continued, moving deliberately to keep himself between Katerina and the door, "just turnips and potatoes, some preserved meats hanging in the back. Nothing of interest, I'm afraid." The investigator's shadow appeared in the doorway, but he didn't descend. The smell of damp earth must have been unappealing, or perhaps he simply believed what he saw. A mundane storage space in a mundane farmhouse owned by mundane people with nothing to hide. "Very well," the rough voice said. We've seen enough. Marcus climbed back up, his movements unhurried, pulling the door closed behind him. The lock clicked into place with a sound of finality. Darkness swallowed Katerina whole once more. But now it was different. Now she knew they were hunting for her specifically. Now she knew the net was tightening. And now she knew that, Marcus and Helena would do absolutely anything, lie, manipulate, imprison her in the dark, to save themselves from the consequences of her 3-year-old silence. Above, the voices faded. The horses finally departed. The farmhouse settled into an eerie quiet. Then Helena's voice drifted down through the floorboards, soft and venomous. 2 more days, Katerina. 2 more days until the stain sets properly, and then we'll see about teaching you exactly what story you'll tell if they come back. In the darkness, Katerina touched her face. The mixture had hardened completely now. A second skin that pulled and burned and transformed her into someone else. Someone who couldn't be the witness. Someone who didn't exist 3 years ago in those woods. Someone who would have to live with lies layered upon lies until she couldn't remember what the truth looked like anymore. Unless she found the courage to do what she should have done that day in the forest. Scream. The 3rd day arrived with a pale dawn that filtered through the cellar's exterior door cracks like accusations written in light. Katerina had stopped counting the hours somewhere around the 2nd night, when hunger and thirst and the constant burning of her transformed face had blurred time into something fluid and meaningless. Her fingers traced the stained skin tentatively, feeling ridges and textures that hadn't existed before. The mixture had done its work with ruthless efficiency, creating the illusion of old burn. Scars, thick, discolored tissue that pulled at her features and made her face feel like it belonged to someone else. Helena came for her as the sun reached its zenith, her footsteps on the cellar stairs measured and purposeful. She carried a bucket of cold water and a rough cloth, her expression carefully neutral as she studied her handiwork in the dim light. "It's permanent," Helena said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "The scarring, it won't fade. I made certain of that." Katerina said nothing. What words could possibly matter now? Her silence had cost the Queen's life 3 years ago, and now it had cost her own face, her own identity. Speaking seemed like a luxury she no longer deserved. "Clean yourself," Helena commanded, setting down the bucket. "Slowly. The skin is still tender beneath the stain. Then come upstairs. There are visitors." Ice flooded Katerina's veins despite the cellar's musty warmth. "The investigators came back?" "No." Helena's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Someone far more dangerous. The king himself arrived in the village this morning. He's questioning every household personally. He'll be here within the hour." The bucket slipped from Katerina's numb fingers, water sloshing across the dirt floor. The king, King Henrique, whose wife she'd watched die, whose grief had become a kingdom's obsession, whose investigators had been hunting for 3 years to understand why the Queen's carriage went over that ravine. "You'll speak only if directly addressed," Helena continued, her voice dropping to a whisper sharp as broken glass. "You'll tell him you were burned 4 years ago in a kitchen accident. You'll say you know nothing about the Queen's death because you were nowhere near the forest that day. You were here recovering from your injuries, too traumatized to leave the farm. Do you understand?" Katerina's throat closed around the lies she was being ordered to speak, but she nodded. Because what? Choice remained. Her face had been transformed into a monument to deception. She was already living the lie every time she drew breath. Helena climbed back up the stairs, leaving Katerina alone with the bucket and her reflection in the water's dark surface. The face that stared back was alien. Mottled black and brown stains covered her cheeks, her forehead, crept down her neck like creeping vines of shame. Her shorn hair, growing back in uneven patches, completed the picture of someone who'd survived catastrophe. Just not the catastrophe everyone would believe. She cleaned herself mechanically, the cold water biting against her altered skin. Each touch was a reminder of what she'd become, a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect guilty people from the consequences of her own cowardice. When she finally emerged from the cellar, the farmhouse was transformed. Helena had arranged everything with meticulous precision. Fresh flowers in cheap clay vases, the floors swept clean, the table set with their best pottery. Marcus stood by the window, his jaw tight with tension, watching the road. Their 2 sons had been sent to stay with neighbors, removing potential complications from the performance about to unfold. "He's coming," Marcus breathed, his knuckles white where they gripped the window frame. 3 riders, the king's in the center. I recognized the royal crest on his horse's saddlecloth. Helena's hand shot out and grabbed Katerina's arm with bruising force, positioning her in the corner of the room where the light was dimmest. "Remember," she hissed, "simple farm girl, scarred and shy. You barely speak. You remember nothing." The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, then stopped outside. Heavy footsteps approached the door. Marcus opened it before the knock came, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. "Your Majesty," he stammered, "we are honored beyond words. Please come in. Our humble home is yours." King Henrique entered, and Katerina's breath caught in her chest despite every effort to remain unremarkable. He was 41 years old, but grief had carved him into something older. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples, and his eyes held a haunted quality that made her want to look away and never stop looking at the same time. He wore traveling clothes rather than royal finery, practical leather and wool that had seen miles of dusty roads. But there was no mistaking the authority in his bearing, the weight of a crown even when it wasn't physically present. 2 guards flanked him, their hands resting casually on sword hilts, their eyes scanning every corner of the room with professional thoroughness. One of them was the investigator with the rough voice from 3 days ago. His gaze landed on Katerina and stayed there, narrowing slightly. "You must be Marcus and Helena," the king said, his voice rougher than Katerina had expected, worn down by years of unanswered questions. "I apologize for the intrusion. I'm speaking with everyone in the area personally. My investigators are thorough, but sometimes people remember details when talking directly to someone who shares their grief." "Of course, Your Majesty," Helena said, her curtsy perfect despite her trembling hands. "We've told your men everything we know, which is unfortunately very little. We were shocked by the Queen's death. She was beloved by all." The king's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the past. Tense. 3 years, and he still wasn't reconciled to speaking of his wife as someone who existed only in memory. His eyes swept the room and landed on Katerina. She felt his gaze like a physical weight, pinning her to the spot. For a long moment, he simply stared, and she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition. Impossible. He'd never seen her before, but there was something in the way he looked at her, as if he were seeing past the stained skin to something underneath. "And you are?" he asked, taking a step toward her. Katerina's mouth went dry. Helena had coached her, but suddenly every prepared word evaporated like morning mist. The king stood less than 5 feet away now, close enough that she could see the grief etched into every line of his face, close enough to see that his eyes weren't just brown, but flecked with amber, like autumn leaves before they fell. "Katerina, Your Majesty," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She curtsied clumsily, aware of how her rough work dress and scarred appearance must look to someone who lived among silks and jewels. "Marcus's cousin. The investigators mentioned you," he said softly. "Not an accusation, just a statement. You were burned 4 years ago, Your Majesty." The lie tasted like ash on her tongue. "A kitchen accident. I've been recovering here since then." The king studied her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle beneath the stains. Not with disgust at her disfigurement, but with something else. Curiosity? Suspicion? She couldn't read him, and that terrified her more than the investigators' questions had. 4 years, he repeated slowly, as if testing the timeline against some internal calculation. "So you would have been 15 then, and you've lived here ever since?" "Yes, Your Majesty. And 3 years ago when my wife died, you were here, recovering?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by thread. Katerina felt Helena's eyes boring into her back, felt Marcus's terror radiating across the room, felt the weight of 3 years of silence pressing down on her chest until she thought her ribs might crack. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered, and the lie joined all the others, piling up like stones on a grave. "I was here. I know nothing about what happened in the forest." The king's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A shadow of disappointment or perhaps resignation. He'd heard this same story from dozens of households. Hundreds of people, all with nothing to offer except condolences and ignorance. But then he did something unexpected. He stepped closer, so close that Katerina could smell leather and road dust and something else, something like cedar and smoke. His hand reached out, and for one heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to touch her face, to trace the false scars that marked her as a liar. Instead, his fingers stopped inches from her cheek, hovering in the air between them. "Your eyes," he said quietly, his voice dropping so low that only she could hear. "They're the same color as the forest on a cloudy day. Gray-green, like storm water. My wife used to paint landscapes. She would have known exactly how to capture that shade." Katerina's heart hammered so violently she was certain he could hear it. What was he saying? What did he see when he looked at her? "There's something about you," the king continued, his voice still pitched for her ears alone. "Something that makes me think. You understand what it means to carry a secret that's slowly destroying you from the inside." The words hit her like a physical blow. Did he know? Could he possibly know? But before she could respond, before she could even process what he was implying, the rough-voiced guard cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we should continue. There are still a dozen households to visit before nightfall." King Henrique stepped back, the moment shattering like ice under pressure. His face closed off, becoming the mask of polite distance royalty wore when dealing with commoners. "Of course. Thank you for your time, Marcus, Helena, and Katerina." He paused on her name, letting it linger. "If you remember anything at all, you can send word to the inn. I'll be staying there for another 3 days." He turned toward the door, then stopped. Without looking back, he said, "The investigators told me about the wagon tracks, the fresh ones outside. You said your son went to the mill." Marcus's face drained of blood. "Yes, Your Majesty, this morning." "Strange," the king mused. "The mill burned down 2 weeks ago. Everyone in the village knows that. So where exactly did your son go?" Silence crashed down like a wave of ice water. Helena's carefully constructed lies began to crumble at the edges. And King Henrique finally turned, his amber-flecked eyes locking onto Katerina's with the force of a man who'd just found the first loose thread in a tapestry of deception. "Perhaps," he said, softly, dangerously, "we should speak again, tomorrow, just you and I, Katerina, without your cousins present. Would that be acceptable?" It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in courtesy, and they all knew it. Katerina's voice came out broken, terrified, honest for the first time in 3 days. "Yes, Your Majesty." The night crawled by like something wounded and desperate to reach dawn. Katerina lay on her thin mattress in the attic, staring at ceiling beams she'd memorized over 3 years of sleepless nights, but tonight they looked different. Tonight they looked like the bars of a cage that was finally closing completely. Marcus and Helena hadn't spoken to her after the king left. They hadn't needed to. The terror in their eyes had communicated everything. She had become a liability they could no longer control, and liabilities in the presence of kings didn't tend to survive long. Around midnight, she heard whispers drifting up through the floorboards. Helena's voice, sharp and urgent. Marcus responding in lower tones, conflicted. Katerina pressed her ear to a gap in the wooden planks and caught fragments that made her blood turn cold. Can't let her talk to him alone. What choice do we have? Refusing the king's request. Accident. People fall from haylofts all the time. Break their necks. I won't. She's family. We've already done enough. Family. Helena's voice rose to a hiss. She'll destroy our family if she tells him the truth. Our Sons will watch us hang for withholding evidence. Is that what you want? Silence followed, heavy and damning. Then Marcus spoke again, so quietly Katerina had to strain to hear. There might be another way, if we leave tonight. Take the boys and disappear before dawn. The king can't question her about us if we're gone. And abandon everything we've built, our land, our home, run like criminals and confirm every suspicion he has. Helena's footsteps paced across the floor below. No, we stay. We act innocent. And we make certain that if Katerina does talk, her word means nothing. Who would believe a scarred, simple farm girl over us? We're respected in this community. We've done nothing wrong except try to protect her. The rationalization was so smooth, so practiced, that Katerina almost believed they believed it. They'd convinced themselves they were victims of her silence, rather than architects of her current nightmare. The human mind's capacity for self-deception was staggering. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because she woke to rough hands shaking her and gray dawn light filtering through the attic window. Helena stood over her, already dressed, her face a mask of false concern that didn't reach her calculating eyes. "The King's Guard is here," Helena said, her voice loud enough to carry. Then she leaned closer, her next words barely a breath against Katerina's ear. "Remember what you are. Remember what you'll go back to if you betray us." The cellar was comfortable compared to what awaits girls who anger powerful families. The threat landed like a stone in Katerina's stomach, but there was something else there too. A tiny spark of fury that 3 years of guilt had nearly extinguished. She'd remained silent to protect herself once. Now silence would protect the people who'd disfigured her. At what point did self-preservation become self-destruction? The guard waiting downstairs wasn't the rough-voiced investigator from before. This one was younger, perhaps 25, with careful eyes and a face that suggested he'd been chosen specifically because he appeared less intimidating. He bowed slightly when Katerina descended the stairs. "Miss Katerina," he said politely, "His Majesty requests your presence at the inn. I'm to escort you there safely. You're not under arrest or suspicion. This is merely a conversation." The careful phrasing was meant to reassure, but Katerina heard what wasn't being said. Not under arrest yet. Not under suspicion yet. The yet hung in the air like smoke. Marcus appeared from the kitchen, his face haggard from a sleepless night. "Will she be returned home afterward?" "That depends on the king, sir." The guard's tone remained neutral, but his eyes flickered to Katerina's scarred face and held there for a moment too long. Pity? Curiosity? She couldn't tell. The walk to the village took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. The guard maintained a respectful distance, not treating her like a prisoner, but not engaging in conversation either. Katerina's mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, 1,000 possible outcomes. She could lie again, maintain the story Helena had crafted. She could tell the truth and watch everything collapse. Or she could do something she hadn't considered until this moment. She could tell part of the truth. Enough to ease her conscience without completely destroying the people who'd raised her, however badly. The inn sat at the village's center, a 2-story structure of stone and timber that usually housed traveling merchants. Today, royal guards flanked the entrance, and the normal morning bustle of the village seemed muted, as if everyone was holding their breath. The guard led Katerina not to the common room, but up a narrow staircase to a private chamber on the 2nd floor. King Enrique stood at the window, his back to the door, looking out over the village square. He didn't turn when they entered, and the guard quietly withdrew, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded final. "Do you know why I insisted on speaking with you alone?" the king asked, his voice tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Not your cousins, not my guards, just you and I." Katerina's throat felt like it was lined with sand. "No, Your Majesty, because liars tell different lies when they're alone." He turned finally, and the morning light streaming through the window illuminated every line of grief on his face. "And truth-tellers tell the same truth regardless of who's listening. I needed to know which one you are." Her hands trembled at her sides. The stained skin on her face felt tight, pulling at muscles reminding her with every expression that she was already lying just by existing. "Your cousins are terrified of you," the king continued, moving away from the window. "I've questioned hundreds of people in 3 years. I know what fear looks like. But their fear isn't of me. It's of you. Of what you might say. That tells me you know something they desperately want kept secret." "I don't," Katerina started, but he held up a hand. "Please, don't insult either of us with another rehearsed denial." He pulled out a chair from the small table in the room's center, gesturing for her to sit. "The mill didn't burn down 2 weeks ago. It burned down 5 years ago. I knew that when I asked the question yesterday. I wanted to see how your cousins would react to being caught in a lie. And I wanted to see how you would react to their lying." Katerina remained standing, frozen, her mind reeling. He'd been testing them, all of them, which meant he already suspected something was desperately wrong. "Your face," the king said softly. "Those scars, they're not 4 years old. The staining is fresh. I've seen burn victims. I know what old scars look like versus new ones. Someone did that to you recently, very recently, within the last week, I'd estimate." The world tilted sideways. Katerina's legs gave out, and she collapsed into the chair he'd offered, her breath coming in sharp gasps. He knew, and everything was about to come crashing down. "Who did it?" the king asked, his voice gentle now, almost kind. "Your cousins." She couldn't speak, couldn't nod, couldn't do anything except sit there with 3 years of guilt and 3 days of new trauma warring inside her chest. The king pulled the other chair closer and sat down, close enough that their knees almost touched. "I'm going to tell you something very few people know. When my wife died, I wasn't just grieving a spouse. I was grieving the loss of ever understanding why. The carriage was examined, the wheels, the harnesses, everything. And there were signs of tampering, small ones, subtle ones. Someone wanted her dead." Katerina's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his. "What?" "For 3 years I've been searching for witnesses, for anyone who saw anything. Because I believe someone was there, someone who knows whether my wife's death was the assassination my nightmares tell me it was, or simply a tragic accident my advisors insist it must have been." His amber-flecked eyes searched her face with an intensity that stripped away every defense. "You were there, weren't you? In the forest that day." The truth rose in her throat like bile, burning, desperate to escape. 3 years of carrying it alone had carved out a hollow space inside her chest, and suddenly the weight was unbearable. "Yes," she whispered, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff. "I was there." The king's face transformed, not with anger or accusation, but with something that looked almost like relief. "Tell me. Everything. From the beginning." So she did. The words poured out in a torrent she couldn't have stopped if she'd wanted to. The herb gathering, the sound of hooves and wheels, looking up to see the royal carriage careening toward the ravine, the wheel that seemed to catch on something, the way the horses screamed, the terrible moment of hanging suspended before the plunge, and her own paralysis, her cowardice, her silence. "I should have screamed," Katerina said, tears streaming down her scarred cheeks. "I should have done something, but I froze, and then I ran, and I've been running ever since." The king listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When she finished, silence filled the room like water, drowning them both. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Did you see anyone else? Anyone near the carriage before it went over?" Katerina closed her eyes, pulling herself back to that moment 3 years ago. She'd been so focused on the carriage, on the queen's screams, that she hadn't... Wait. There had been someone. A figure in the trees on the opposite side of the road, nearly hidden by shadows. She'd registered it peripherally, dismissed it as a trick of light. But now, reaching back through memory with the king's question sharpening her focus, she saw it. Clearly, a man, dark cloak, moving away from the road just as the carriage's wheel caught. "There was someone," she breathed, her eyes flying open. "In the trees. I didn't think about it until now. I was so focused on the carriage that I..." The door burst open with a crash that made them both jump. The rough-voiced guard from the previous day stood there, his sword drawn, his face twisted with something between panic and determination. "Step away from her, Your Majesty," he commanded. Now, the sword gleamed in the morning light streaming through the window, its edge catching the sun like a promise of violence. King Enrique rose slowly from his chair, his body positioning itself between Katerina and the guard with the instinctive protectiveness of someone accustomed to calculating threats in seconds. But there was something in his eyes, not surprise, but a terrible, weary recognition. "Captain Willem," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of authority despite the drawn blade, pointed in his direction. "You're making a mistake that will cost you your life and dishonor your family name for generations." The guard, Captain Willem apparently, didn't lower his weapon. His jaw was clenched so tight Katerina could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. This was a man pushed past the breaking point, operating on desperation rather than reason. "The only mistake I made was 3 years ago when I failed to ensure." "There were no witnesses," Willem said, his voice cracking at the edges. "She saw me. You just said it yourself, Your Majesty. She saw someone in the trees. It was me, and now she'll destroy everything unless you what?" The king's tone turned sharp as the blade between them. "Kill her? Kill me? Do you think you'll walk out of this inn alive if you harm either of us? My guards are stationed outside that door. You have perhaps 30 seconds before they break it down." But Willem's laugh was bitter and broken. "I'm already dead. The moment she remembered my face, my fate was sealed. At least this way I can take the witness with me. Save my family from the shame." Katerina's mind reeled, trying to piece together what was happening. This man, this guard she'd barely noticed during the king's visit yesterday, had been there 3 years ago, had been the figure in the trees, which meant he'd been involved in the queen's death. But why? And how had he ended up as one of the king's own investigators? The king seemed to be calculating the same things, his eyes never leaving Willem's face. "You weren't acting alone. Tell me who ordered it. Give me the name, and I'll ensure your family is spared the worst of the consequences. You have my word as king." "Your word?" Willem's laugh turned into something close to a sob. "Your word means nothing when weighed against what they'll do to my wife, my children if I speak. The people who ordered the queen's death don't leave. Loose ends. They've been watching this investigation for 3 years, waiting to see if anyone got close. And now someone has." He gestured with the sword toward Katerina, the tip wavering as his hand shook. "She's the thread that unravels everything. I heard what she told you through the door. She saw me. If she testifies, if she describes what I looked like 3 years ago, someone will make the connection. And then everyone I love dies screaming." Footsteps thundered up the stairs outside. Voices shouted the king's name. The door handle rattled as someone tested it from the outside, found it locked. Willem must have turned the bolt when he burst in, buying himself these desperate moments. "Stand aside, Your Majesty," Willem said, raising the sword higher. "I don't want to hurt you. I never wanted any of this, but I won't let my family pay for my mistakes." The king didn't move. "You're a good man, Willem. I've known you for 5 years. You served with honor in the border wars. You've been loyal and true. Whatever they offered you, whatever they threatened you with, there's still a chance to choose differently now." "There's no choice." Willem's voice rose to a shout. "There never was. They came to me 6 months before the queen died. They knew things about my wife. Things from before we married. Things that would have seen her burned as a heretic if they became public. They said if I helped them, the secrets would stay buried. If I refused, she'd burn, and my children would watch." The door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it from the outside. Wood splintered around the frame. They had seconds, maybe less. Katerina found her voice, surprised by how steady it sounded despite the terror coursing through her. "Who are they? Give us a name. Just one name. If we know who's behind this, the king can protect your family." Willem's eyes met hers, and she saw something in them that looked like gratitude mixed with despair. "I can't. I've said too much." Already, they have people everywhere. In the court, in the guard, even... The door exploded inward. Guards poured into the room, swords drawn, moving with coordinated precision. But Willem was already moving too. Instead of attacking, he turned the blade inward, the point pressing against his own chest, right over his heart. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," he whispered. "Tell my wife I loved her. Tell her I tried to—" "No!" The king lunged forward, but he was too far away, and Willem was too committed to his final choice. Katerina moved without thinking. Her hand shot out and grabbed the lamp from the table beside her, hurling it at Willem's sword arm. The heavy brass connected with a solid crack, knocking his aim sideways. The blade that should have pierced his heart instead carved a deep gash across his ribs as he stumbled backward. Blood bloomed across his tunic, but he was alive. The guards were on him in seconds, wrestling the sword away, forcing him to his knees. Willem didn't fight them. He looked almost disappointed that even his suicide had been thwarted. The king was at Katerina's side immediately, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak, staring at the blood spreading across the wooden floor. She'd stopped a man from killing himself, saved a would-be murderer's life. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 years ago, she'd frozen and let the queen die. Today, she'd moved without hesitation to save her killer. "Get him." "To the physician," the king ordered. "I want him alive and able to speak. Post guards at his door. No one sees him without my explicit permission. And find his family. Bring them here immediately. They're under royal protection as of this moment." The guards hauled Willem to his feet. As they dragged him toward the door, he looked back at Katerina with eyes that held a complexity of emotions. Regret, gratitude, and a warning that made her skin prickle. "The diary," he gasped, blood flecking his lips. The queen's diary. She knew. She wrote it all down. "If you want the truth, find the diary." Then he was gone, leaving behind a room that smelled of blood and desperation and secrets that were finally clawing their way toward light. The king turned to his remaining guards. "Clear the inn. I want every guest questioned. Find out if anyone else heard what was said in this room. And send word to the capital. I need my most trusted advisors here within 2 days. No one from the regular council." As the guards dispersed to carry out his orders, the king sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 41 years and more. He pressed his palms against his eyes, shoulders shaking with something that might have been grief or rage or simple exhaustion. Katerina stood frozen, her mind trying to process everything that had just happened. The queen's death hadn't been an accident. It had been an assassination, ordered by people powerful enough to have spies everywhere. Executed by a good man forced into evil by threats against his family. And the queen herself had known something. Something important enough to write down. Important enough that someone had wanted her silenced. "Your Majesty," Katerina said softly. "The diary he mentioned. Do you know where it is?" The king lowered his hands and his face was ravaged. After Eleanor died, her personal effects were catalogued and stored, but her diary was never found. We assumed it was lost in the accident. Perhaps thrown from the carriage when it went over the ravine. If it survived, if someone took it. He trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air. "Then whoever has it knows exactly who ordered the assassination," Katerina finished. "And they've been sitting on that knowledge for 3 years. The king's hands clenched into fists on his knees. Waiting. Watching. Possibly using it to manipulate court politics, to advance their own position while I've been chasing shadows." Horrible thought occurred to Katerina. The people who forced Captain Willem to help them, if they've been watching the investigation, if they have spies everywhere, then they know I'm here. They know I'm a witness. They know I saw Willem that day. The king's eyes met hers, and she saw her own fear reflected back. "You're right. And if Willem was willing to kill himself rather than let his family face their retribution, then you're in more danger than you can possibly imagine." As if summoned. By his words, a commotion erupted from the floor below. Shouting, the clash of steel, then a scream that cut off abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than the noise had been. The king rose, drawing the dagger from his belt. "Get behind me." But Katerina was already moving toward the window, her survival instincts finally overriding 3 years of paralysis. She looked down at the village square and felt her heart stop. The inn was surrounded. At least 24 armed men, wearing no identifying colors or crests, formed a loose perimeter. They weren't royal guards. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of professional soldiers, and they were systematically cutting off every exit. "They're here," Katerina whispered. "Whoever ordered the Queen's death. They're here for us." The king joined her at the window, his face going pale as he assessed the situation. "This isn't random. This was planned. They knew we'd be alone. They knew the inn would be vulnerable during the morning when most of my guards are spread throughout the village questioning people." A new sound reached them. Footsteps on the stairs. Multiple sets, moving fast. Not running, but advancing with purpose. The king positioned himself in front of Katerina again, his dagger held in a fighter's grip that spoke of actual battlefield experience. "When they come through that door," he said quietly, "you run. There's a back staircase servants use. Get to the stable, take my horse. The guards know to obey. You if you're riding it. And ride for the castle. Tell the captain of the guard everything. He's one of the few people I trust completely. I'm not leaving you two. That's not a request." The king's voice carried the full weight of royal command. "You're the only witness, the only person who can testify to what happened. If you die, the truth dies with you, and my wife's murderers win. You will live, Katerina, even if I don't." The footsteps reached the landing, stopped outside the splinter-domed door. A voice called out, cultured and cold. "Your Majesty, we mean you no harm. We simply require the girl. Send her out, and we'll withdraw peacefully." The king's laugh was harsh. "Do you take me for a fool? The moment she steps into that hallway, she's dead. Perhaps, but if she doesn't, you both are." The cultured voice beyond the door belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone who'd issued death sentences with the same casual tone others used to order wine. Katerina's entire body trembled as she watched King Henrique position himself between her and the entrance, his dagger looking pitifully inadequate against whatever force waited in the hallway. 3 years ago, she'd frozen when action could have saved a life. Now, watching the king prepare to die for her, something fundamental shifted inside her chest, a shattering of the paralysis that had defined her since that day in the forest. "There's another way," she whispered urgently, her mind racing through the inn's layout. She'd delivered preserves here twice a month for years, knew every corner of the building. "The servants' entrance you mentioned, it doesn't just lead to the stables. There's a root cellar access from the kitchen. It connects to an old smuggler's tunnel that comes out near the river." The king's eyes sharpened with interest even as his body remained coiled for combat. "How do you know this?" "The innkeeper's daughter told me. They used it during the grain wars 20 years ago when taxi collectors came." Katerina moved toward the corner of the room where she knew, from the building's structure, the walls would be thinnest. "If we can get to the floor below without using the stairs..." A thunderous crash interrupted her as something heavy slammed against the door. The remaining hinges groaned, wood splintering further. They had seconds, not minutes. The king didn't question her further. He crossed to the window and looked down at the slanted roof of the inn's lower addition, a storage wing that jutted out from the main building. "Can you climb?" Katerina nodded, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might break free of her ribs. The king sheathed his dagger and grabbed the heavy wooden chair, swinging it against the window with controlled force. Glass shattered outward, glittering in the morning sun like scattered diamonds. He used the chair leg to clear the remaining shards from the frame. Behind them, the door gave way with a tortured shriek of failing wood. Men poured into the room, 5 of them, dressed in nondescript traveling clothes that could belong to merchants or farmers, but moving with the coordinated precision of trained killers. The one in front, the owner of that cultured voice, had silver threading through his dark beard and eyes that were utterly empty of mercy. "Your Majesty," he said with mock courtesy, even as his companions fanned out to block any escape route except the shattered window. How terribly undignified. "Surely we..." can resolve this without you climbing out windows like a common thief." The king was already helping Katerina through the frame, his hand steady despite the danger. "I've found that dignity matters far less than survival," he replied, his tone almost conversational. "Tell your employer, whoever that coward is, that I will find them. I will expose every conspirator, and I will ensure their deaths are anything but dignified." The silver-bearded man's smile never reached his eyes. Bold words from a king about to fall to his death from a second-story window. Katerina was halfway through the frame when she heard the whisper of steel leaving a sheath. She looked back in time to see one of the assassins drawing a throwing knife, his arm already cocking back for the throw aimed at the king's exposed back. "Down!" she screamed. The king dropped into a crouch, and the knife whistled past where his head had been, embedding itself in the window frame with a solid thunk. But the throw had been a feint. Two more assassins rushed forward while their leader's attention was divided. Katerina watched in horror as the king drew his dagger and met the first attacker's sword with a move that spoke of genuine combat training. Sparks flew as blade met blade, but he was one man with a dagger against 5 with swords. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Katerina's fingers found purchase on the rough shingles of the roof below. She pulled herself fully through the window, her feet finding the slope. But instead of climbing down toward safety as the king had intended, she moved laterally along the roof until she reached the main building's wall, where she hoped, there would be a drain pipe. The old iron was rusted but still firmly attached to the stone. She grabbed it and swung herself around, her feet finding the narrow ledge that ran along the building's exterior at this level. It was barely 6 inches wide, meant for maintenance access, and her scarred face pressed against cold stone as she inched toward the window of the adjacent room. Inside the king's chamber, she could hear the clash of combat. Steel on steel, grunts of effort, the king's voice raised in a battle cry that was half rage and half grief. She couldn't think about what was happening behind her. Couldn't let herself imagine him falling. She had to focus on the impossible thing she was attempting. Reaching the next window, breaking through and somehow flanking the assassins from an unexpected angle. The window of the adjacent room was closed but not latched. Katerina wedged her fingers under the frame and pulled, her muscles screaming with effort. It opened with a reluctant creak that seemed impossibly loud. She threw herself through, landing hard on the floor of what appeared to be a storage room filled with linens and cleaning supplies. Through the wall, she could hear the fight continuing. Something heavy crashed, furniture overturning. A man cried out in pain, but she couldn't tell if it was the king or one of his attackers. Katerina grabbed the first weapon-like object she could find, a heavy iron fire poker leaning against the fireplace, and ran into the hallway. The door to the king's room stood open, offering a view of organized chaos. The king was backed into the corner by the window, blood streaming from a cut on his left arm, his dagger somehow still in his hand. 2 of the assassins lay on the floor, one motionless, the other clutching his leg and moaning. But 3 remained standing, including the silver-bearded leader, and they were closing in with the patient confidence of hunters who'd cornered their prey. Katerina didn't let herself think. 3 years of thinking had accomplished nothing but prolonged cowardice. She ran into the room and swung the poker with all her strength at the nearest assassin's back. The iron connected with his spine with a sickening crack, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The silver-bearded leader spun toward her, his eyes widening fractionally, the only emotion he'd shown. "Resourceful," he murmured, almost admiringly, before his sword came up to engage her makeshift weapon. But the distraction was enough. The king lunged forward, his dagger finding the gap in the remaining assassin's guard, sliding between ribs with the precision of someone who'd been taught anatomy along with swordsmanship. The man gasped and fell, leaving only the leader standing. For a heartbeat, the 3 of them stood frozen in a triangle of mutual assessment. The silver-bearded man looked between the king and Katerina, calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. His men were dead or disabled. Reinforcements would take minutes to arrive, and the king's guards would be fighting their way toward this room. He'd failed his mission, and they all knew it. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "The girl's existence is now known to people far more powerful than you can protect her from, Your Majesty. They will never stop hunting her. Every day she draws breath is a day they cannot rest easy. Let them lose sleep," the king replied, his voice rough with exertion and barely contained fury. "I've had 3 years of sleepless nights. They've earned their share." The assassin leader moved so fast that Katerina almost didn't see it. His hand dipped into his cloak and emerged with a small glass vial that he threw at the king's feet. It shattered, releasing a cloud of acrid smoke that instantly filled the room, burning eyes and throats, making vision impossible. Katerina heard footsteps retreating, the assassin using the chaos to escape, but she couldn't see through the chemical haze to stop him. Strong hands found her arm, the king's grip, pulling her toward the window. "We go now, while the smoke covers our escape too." They climbed through the shattered frame together, the king moving with surprising agility despite his wounded arm. The slanted roof below them was slick with morning dew, treacherous but navigable. Behind them, shouts echoed through the inn as royal guards finally fought through whatever obstacles had delayed them. But Katerina and the king were already sliding down to the lower roof's edge, then dropping into the narrow alley behind the building. The king leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing hard, pressing his hand against the wound on his arm to slow the bleeding. "The tunnel you mentioned, can you find the entrance?" Katerina nodded, all ready, moving toward the kitchen's exterior door. The innkeeper lay slumped just inside, unconscious but breathing, hit from behind, judging by the lump forming on the back of his head. The assassins had been thorough in their preparation. She stepped over him and found the trapdoor concealed beneath a worn rug near the cold storage. It opened with a protesting groan of disused hinges. Below, stone steps descended into darkness that smelled of damp earth and old secrets. The king followed her down, pulling the trapdoor closed above them. For a moment, they stood in absolute blackness, their harsh breathing the only sound. Then the king produced a small flint and steel from his belt, striking sparks until he found an old torch mounted on the wall. The flame caught reluctantly, casting dancing shadows across walls that wept with moisture. "I need to tell you something," the king said quietly, his eyes meeting hers in the flickering light. "Before we go further, before whatever comes next." Katerina waited, her heart still hammering from the fight, from the near death, from everything that had happened in the space of one impossible morning. "My wife knew she was going to die," the king said, each word costing him something. 3 weeks before the accident, she came to me in the middle of the night, told me she'd discovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of court. She was gathering evidence, writing everything down. She said if anything happened to her, I should find her diary and trust no one except... His voice cracked. She never finished the sentence. She said she'd tell me the rest when her investigation was complete. She died before she could. The implications crashed over Katerina like a physical wave. She knew someone was planning to kill her, and she died anyway, trying to expose them. "She was the bravest person I've ever known," the king whispered, "and I failed to protect her. For 3 years I've been trying to find anyone who could tell me what happened. And now you're here telling me you watched her die while I..." He stopped, his face twisting with anguish. "While I was in the castle, meeting with advisors, completely unaware that the love of my life was plummeting to her death." Katerina reached out and touched his uninjured arm, a gesture that would have been unthinkable hours ago. "We both failed her that day, but we can still finish what she started. Find the diary, expose the conspiracy, make her death mean something." The king looked at her scarred face, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition of a kindred spirit, perhaps, someone else who carried unbearable guilt but refused to let it become paralysis. "Then let's go," he said, raising the torch. "Before they find this tunnel, before they send more killers." They moved deeper into the darkness, following a passage that wound beneath the village toward the river. Behind them, the sounds of chaos in the inn faded to silence. But Katerina knew the quiet was temporary. The silver-bearded assassin had escaped. He would report back to his masters, and now the hunt would intensify beyond anything they'd faced so far. Because she wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the king's ally, and together, they were going to tear down whatever conspiracy had murdered a queen. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness that seemed to swallow the torchlight before it could penetrate more than a few feet. Water dripped from the ceiling in a steady rhythm that echoed off stone walls, creating the illusion of footsteps following behind them. Katerina's hand trailed along the rough-hewn rock for balance as they descended deeper beneath the village, the air growing colder with each step. The king moved ahead of her, his wounded arm held close to his body, the torch creating shadows that danced across his face and made him look like a man being pursued by ghosts. They'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when the tunnel split into 3 passages. The king stopped, raising the torch to examine each opening. Which way? Katerina closed her eyes, trying to remember the innkeeper's daughter's descriptions from years ago. The rightmost passage leads to an old wine cellar that collapsed. The center goes to the river but floods during heavy rain. The left one... She paused, concentrating. The left one has a secondary branch that comes up inside the old monastery gardens. That's the one we want. They took the left passage, the ceiling lowering until both of them had to duck. The king's breathing had become labored, and when Katerina glanced back, she saw fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage he'd torn from his shirt to bind his arm. The wound needed proper attention, but stopping now would be suicide. The assassins would be searching the village systematically, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the tunnel entrance. "Your Majesty," Katerina said softly, "your arm will survive until—" "We reach safety," he interrupted, but his voice was strained. "Tell me about your cousins, Marcus and Helena. What will happen to them when the investigators discover they disfigured you?" The question caught Katerina off guard. In the chaos of assassins and revelations and near death, she'd almost forgotten about the people who'd started this nightmare by cutting her hair and staining her face. "I don't know," she admitted. "They were trying to protect themselves, protect their children, by mutilating you," the king said flatly. "By making you unrecognizable so they couldn't be implicated in harboring a witness. That's not protection. That's self-preservation at your expense." Katerina wanted to argue, wanted to defend them somehow, but the words wouldn't come, because he was right. Marcus and Helena had chosen themselves over her, had chosen their fear over her humanity. And yet some small part of her still remembered Marcus letting her steal extra bread as a child. Helena, teaching her to read when no one else cared if an orphaned cousin could form letters. People were capable of both kindness and cruelty, often toward the same person. The contradiction made her head ache. They reached the secondary branch Katerina had mentioned, a narrow passage that angled sharply upward. The king went first, using his good hand to pull himself up the steep incline. Katerina followed, her fingers finding holds in the rough stone. The torch cast wild shadows that made the tunnel seem alive, breathing with them, closing in and expanding with each movement. Halfway up, the king's hand slipped. He caught himself with a grunt of pain, but the torch fell from his grip, tumbling down the incline toward Katerina. She grabbed for it reflexively, catching it before it could hit the ground and extinguish, leaving them in absolute darkness. But the sudden movement caused her to lose her own balance. For one terrifying moment, she teetered backward, the torchlight spinning crazily. Across the walls. The king's hand shot down and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in with desperate strength. "I have you," he gasped, pulling her upward until she found her footing again. They stood pressed together in the narrow space, both breathing hard, the torch trapped between them, casting their faces in harsh relief. "Thank you," Katerina whispered. The king's eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw past the crown and the authority to the man underneath. Someone as broken by loss, as she was by guilt. Someone who'd spent 3 years searching for answers that might destroy him when he finally found them. "We save each other," he said quietly. "That's how this works now. Neither of us survives alone." They continued climbing until the passage leveled out and ended at a wooden door so old and warped that roots had grown through the gaps. The king put his shoulder against it and shoved. The door gave way with a shriek of protesting wood, and suddenly they were stumbling into... Gray daylight filtered through a canopy of ancient oak trees. The monastery gardens stretched around them, overgrown and wild after decades of neglect following the religious wars. Stone benches crumbled beneath ivy, and what had once been carefully tended herb beds now rioted with weeds. But it was abandoned, private, and most importantly, hidden from the main roads where assassins would be searching. The king collapsed onto one of the stone benches, his face pale beneath the dirt and blood. Katerina knelt beside him, examining his wounded arm with hands that shook despite her efforts to stay calm. The cut was deep but clean, running from his bicep to his elbow. It had bled heavily but didn't appear to have hit anything vital. "I need to clean it," she said, looking around the overgrown garden. "There should be yarrow growing here if the monk's plantings survived, and maybe some comfrey for a poultice." "You know herbs," the king observed, watching her move through the garden with purpose, identifying plants with the confidence of someone who'd been trained well. "Your grandmother taught you." "She taught me everything she knew about healing," Katerina replied, finding a patch of yarrow near what had once been a fountain. She crushed the leaves between her palms, releasing the sharp medicinal scent. "She said knowledge was the only inheritance worth having, that you could lose gold or land or titles, but what you knew lived in your bones and couldn't be stolen." She returned to the king and began cleaning the wound as gently as she could, using water from a relatively clear pool in the ruined fountain and the crushed yarrow to stanch the bleeding. He flinched but didn't cry out, his jaw clenched against the pain. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She died when I was 14, Katerina said softly. 5 years ago. Sometimes I think if she'd lived, if she'd been there that day in the forest, she would have known what to do. She wouldn't have frozen like I did. She would have screamed, would have tried to help, would have done something other than run and hide like a coward." The king's good hand covered hers, stopping her ministrations. "You were 16 years old, a child. You witnessed something traumatic and reacted the way most people would react, with fear. The guilt you've carried for 3 years isn't justice. It's punishment you don't deserve." Tears blurred Katerina's vision, hot and unexpected. "Your wife died because..." "I was too afraid to..." "My wife died because someone cut the harness on her carriage," the king interrupted firmly. "Someone who'd planned her murder carefully and executed it with precision. You were an accidental witness, not a participant. And if you'd screamed, if you'd run toward the carriage instead of away, the most likely outcome is that you'd be dead too. The assassins would have killed you to eliminate the witness." The logic was sound, but logic couldn't touch the raw wound of guilt that had lived inside Katerina's chest for 3 years. Still, something in the king's words, the absolute certainty in his voice, eased the grip of self-hatred just slightly, enough to let her breathe a little deeper. She finished binding his arm with strips torn from her underskirt, tying it tight enough to hold but not so tight it would cut off circulation. "We need to find somewhere safer, and we need to figure out where the Queen's diary might be." The king nodded, standing with effort. Eleanor had a lady-in-waiting she trusted above all others, a woman named Catherine who'd been with her since childhood. If anyone would know where the diary is, it would be her. But Catherine left court 2 years ago, claimed she needed to return home to care for her aging mother. "Do you think she was running? Afraid of the conspiracy?" "Or part of it," the king said grimly. "At this point, I trust no one except the people who've nearly died with me today. Which is you, and only you." A sound reached them from beyond the garden walls. Horses, multiple riders, moving at a deliberate pace. Searching. The king and Katerina exchanged a look of shared terror and moved deeper into the overgrown vegetation, pressing themselves against the monastery's crumbling stone wall, where ivy provided some concealment. The riders passed slowly, their voices carrying on the wind. Katerina caught fragments of conversation, orders to search every building, questions about a scarred girl and a wounded man, promises of gold for information. The conspiracy's reach was terrifying. They'd mobilized what sounded like dozens of men within hours of the failed assassination attempt. That kind of coordination required enormous resources and power. When the sounds finally faded, the king turned to Katerina with an expression that was equal parts determination and resignation. "I'm going to tell you something that could get us both executed for treason if anyone overhears. Are you prepared for that?" Katerina's heart hammered, but she nodded. She'd already crossed so many lines today that one more seemed almost inevitable. "I believe the conspiracy involves my own brother," the king said, each word obviously costing him. "Prince Edmund. He's next in line for the throne. Eleanor and I had no children. If I die without an heir, he becomes king. And he's always been ambitious, always believed he deserved the crown more than I did." The revelation hit like a physical blow. A prince, the king's own blood. But to murder the queen, to remove any possibility of an heir, the king finished. If Eleanor had lived, if we'd had children, Edmund's claim would have been pushed further down the line of succession. But with her dead and me unmarried, childless, and unlikely to remarry given my grief, he's one accident away from the throne. "And now you're investigating," Katerina breathed. "Now you're close to discovering the truth, which makes you the next target, which makes us both." "Targets," the king corrected. "You're the witness who can connect Captain Willem to the scene. I'm the threat to their entire conspiracy. Together, we're the two pieces that could bring down a prince and everyone supporting him." A new sound intruded, closer this time. Footsteps in the monastery itself, boots on stone, searching methodically through the abandoned building. They'd found the tunnel exit. They knew the king and Katerina had come this way. The king drew his dagger with his good hand, positioning himself in front of Katerina again. But they both knew the mathematics. He was wounded, exhausted, armed with only a blade. She was untrained in combat, and the searchers would be fresh, numerous, and heavily armed. "There's a wall at the back of the garden," Katerina whispered urgently. "Low enough to climb. On the other side is the forest. If we can reach the trees before they see us." "Go," the king commanded. "I'll hold them here as long as I can. You run, find help, get to the castle." "No." Katerina's voice was firm despite her terror. "You said we save each other, that neither of us survives alone. I'm not leaving you to die so I can maybe escape. We go together or not at all." For a moment, the king looked like he might argue. Then something in his expression softened. Respect, perhaps, or simply recognition that she meant what she said. "Together, then. But if I fall, you keep running. Promise me." Katerina couldn't promise that, couldn't imagine leaving him behind. The way she'd failed to help the queen. But she nodded anyway, because sometimes lies were kinder than truth. They moved as quietly as possible toward the back wall, using the overgrown vegetation as cover. The footsteps in the monastery grew louder, closer. Voices called out, coordinating the search. Any second now, someone would emerge into the garden, would see them, would sound the alarm. The wall was 10 feet away, then 5. The king boosted Katerina up first, his injured arm protesting, but holding. She scrambled over the top and dropped to the other side, landing in soft forest loam. The king followed, moving more slowly, his strength clearly fading. Behind them, a shout went up. They'd been spotted. The king grabbed Katerina's hand and they ran, crashing through underbrush, ignoring the branches that tore at clothes and skin. Behind them, more shouts, the sounds of pursuit, the certain knowledge that this time, there might be no escape. The forest swallowed them whole. Ancient oaks and thick underbrush creating a maze of shadows and twisted roots that grabbed at their feet like grasping fingers. Katerina's lungs burned with each gasping breath, her legs screaming in protest as she ran beside the king through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and shatter hope. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, horses crashing through undergrowth, men shouting coordinates, the organized efficiency of a hunt that had its prey cornered and knew it. The king stumbled, his wounded arm finally betraying him as his hand caught on a low branch and sent agony shooting through his system. Katerina caught him before he fell completely, her arms wrapping around his waist, taking some of his weight. For a moment they stood frozen, pressed together, listening to the sounds of death approaching through the trees. His heart hammered against her cheek, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. "There's a ravine ahead," the king gasped, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "I can hear water. If we can reach it before they close the distance, the current might carry us downstream far enough to lose them." Katerina's blood turned to ice. A ravine. Water. The echo of 3 years ago crashed over her, the queen's carriage teetering on the edge, the screams, the sickening sound of wood and bone breaking against rocks. Her feet stopped moving, paralysis seizing her muscles with the same iron grip that had frozen her that day in the forest. "I can't," she whispered, the words torn from someplace deep and broken inside her. "Not water, not a ravine. I can't." The king's good hand gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're remembering. But that day doesn't define what happens now. You're not the same girl who froze 3 years ago. You saved my life twice today. You're strong enough for this." "I'm not," Katerina sobbed, shame and terror warring in her chest. "I've never been strong enough. That's why your wife died. That's why everything—" A arrow whispered past her ear, so close she felt the fletching brush her hair before it embedded itself in the tree trunk beside them with a solid thunk. The king pulled her down into a crouch, his eyes scanning the forest behind them. Through the trees, she could see movement, at least 6 men on foot, more on horseback, hanging back where the forest was less dense. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the pursuers reached them. "The ravine or death," the king said simply, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the exhaustion. "Those are our choices, and I'm not ready to die. Not when we're this close to exposing the people who murdered my wife. Are you?" Something in his words, the raw honesty, the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable, pierced through Katerina's paralysis. She thought of the queen, writing in her diary about conspiracies she'd discovered, knowing death was coming but gathering evidence anyway, brave until the end. And here was Katerina, the coward who'd watched her die, being offered a chance to finish what the queen had started, to make that death mean something beyond senseless loss. "No," Katerina whispered, then louder. "No, I'm not ready to die." They ran. The sound of water grew from a whisper to a roar as they crashed through the last barrier of underbrush and found themselves on the edge of a ravine that split the earth like an open wound. 15 feet below, a river churned over rocks worn smooth by centuries of current, the water brown with sediment from recent rains. It wasn't the same ravine where the queen had died. That one was miles away. But the similarity was close enough to make Katerina's vision blur with the overlay of past trauma on present terror. Behind them, their pursuers burst through the trees. The king didn't hesitate. He grabbed Katerina's hand and jumped, pulling her with him into empty air. For one suspended moment, they were flying, falling, time stretching impossibly as her stomach lurched and her scream caught in her throat. Then they hit the water with simultaneous impacts that drove the air from her lungs and sent shocking cold through every nerve. The current grabbed them immediately, tumbling them like leaves in a storm. Katerina's head went under, water filling her nose and mouth, the world becoming a chaotic swirl of brown and black and the desperate need for air. Her hand, still clutched in the king's grip, was the only anchor to reality. She felt him pulling her upward, toward light, toward oxygen. They broke the surface together, gasping, choking, already being swept downstream at a speed that made thought impossible. Rocks loomed ahead, a cluster of boulders that split the current into channels. The king wrapped his good arm around Katerina's waist and used his body to shield her from the worst of the impact as they careened through the gap. She felt him take the brunt of the collision, heard his grunt of pain, but his grip never loosened. They were in this together. Drowning or surviving, it would be as one. The river bent sharply, the current pushing them toward the far bank. The king kicked with his legs, using the momentum to angle them toward an overhanging tree whose roots extended into the water like grasping fingers. His hand caught one of the roots, and suddenly they had an anchor. He pulled Katerina close to the bank, helping her find purchase on the muddy slope. They crawled out of the water like creatures being born into a harsh new world, collapsing on the bank in a tangle of sodden clothes and heaving lungs. For long moments, neither could speak, their bodies too busy dragging air back into oxygen-starved systems. Katerina's scarred face pressed against mud that smelled of decay and earth, and she'd never been more grateful for the solid reality of ground beneath her. "Are you hurt?" the king finally managed, his voice scraped raw. Katerina took inventory. Bruises blooming across her ribs, cuts from rocks and branches, the constant burn of her stained face, but nothing broken. "No. You? I'll live." He sat up slowly, cradling his wounded arm. The makeshift bandage had been torn away by the current, and the wound was bleeding again, though not as heavily as before. The cold water had probably helped staunch it. "We need to keep moving. They'll search both banks. We have maybe 10 minutes before they figure out where we exited the river." But Katerina wasn't listening. Her attention had been caught by something carved into the tree whose roots had saved them. Symbols cut deep into the bark, old but still visible. She recognized them from her grandmother's teachings about the religious wars. "This is a waymarker," she breathed. "The old priests used them to mark safe houses during the purges. If we follow the trail..." The king was already on his feet, examining the carvings. "Can you read them?" "My grandmother could. She taught me some of it." Katerina traced the symbols with trembling fingers, reaching back through memory to lessons learned in childhood. "This one means sanctuary, and this..." She paused, frowning. "This is a direction marker, north-northwest. There should be another tree marked within 100 paces. They found it exactly 87 paces away, another ancient oak with fresh scars in its bark, where someone had recently recarved the fading symbols. Someone was maintaining the old network, which meant the safe houses might still be operational. The trail led them deeper into forest that grew increasingly dense and dark, following a path that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. Twice they heard horses in the distance, the searchers spreading out, but the sound never came close enough to be truly threatening. The waymarkers knew what they were doing, leading them along routes that avoided main paths, that used natural cover, that had been designed centuries ago by people who understood that sometimes faith required hiding from those who would destroy it. The fourth marker led them to what appeared to be a solid wall of thorny blackberry brambles, but when Katerina examined it closely, she found a gap, narrow, concealed, but passable if you knew to look for it. They squeezed through, thorns catching on clothes already torn by the day's ordeals, and emerged into a small clearing that held a structure so overgrown with ivy and moss it was almost invisible. A chapel, tiny, maybe 15 feet square, built from stone that had weathered centuries of neglect but still stood solid. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, but it opened when the king pushed it. Inside, the air smelled of old incense and older prayers, of a faith that had survived being outlawed and hunted and nearly erased from memory. And sitting on the single stone bench inside, as if she'd been waiting for them, was an old woman with silver hair and eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades. She looked up as they entered, her expression unsurprised, almost expectant. "Your Majesty," she said calmly, as if kings regularly stumbled into her hidden chapel bleeding and soaking wet. "And the witness. I wondered when you'd find your way here." The king's hand went to where his dagger would have been if the river hadn't claimed it. "Who are you? How do you know who you are?" The old woman smiled, and it transformed her weathered face into something almost beautiful. "I was Queen Eleanor's nurse when she was a child, and later I was the one she trusted with her secrets, including where she hid the diary you're searching for." Katerina's heart stopped, then started again at twice its normal speed. "You have it? The Queen's diary?" "Had," the woman corrected. I gave it to someone for safekeeping 3 years ago when I realized the conspiracy was hunting for it. Someone I thought I could trust. Someone who swore on everything holy that they would keep it safe until the right moment came to reveal the truth. Her expression darkened. I was wrong. They've been using it instead, using the information in it to manipulate court politics, to consolidate power, to build their own position, while destroying anyone who threatened them. Who? The king's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 3 years of grief and rage. Who did you give it to? The old woman met his eyes steadily, and Katerina saw tears begin to track down her weathered cheeks. Your brother's wife, Princess Margaret, the woman you trust above almost anyone in court, the woman who's been counseling you on matters of state since Eleanor died, the woman who's been standing at your side while orchestrating your downfall. The silence that followed was so complete that Katerina could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the king's breathing change as the revelation crashed over him. Not just his brother as part of the conspiracy, but his sister-in-law actively working to destroy him. Someone he'd trusted, grieved with, relied upon. Where is she now? The king finally asked, his voice hollow. At the castle, waiting for news of your death. When the assassins return empty-handed, she'll know her conspiracy is unraveling. She'll move to secure her position, probably by claiming you've gone mad with grief, that you need to be removed from the throne for the kingdom's safety. Your brother will be crowned by week's end, and she'll rule through him. The old woman stood, moving toward a loose stone in the chapel's wall. But I have something that might stop them. Not the diary. That's still hidden at the castle where I can't reach it. But letters. Correspondence between the conspirators that Eleanor intercepted before she died. Enough to prove treason, if you can get them to the right people. She pulled the stone free and extracted a leather satchel that had been concealed in the hollow behind it. The king took it with shaking hands, opening it to reveal yellowed parchment covered in elegant handwriting. His eyes scanned the first letter, and Katerina saw his face drain of color. "This is my brother's handwriting," he whispered. "Planning Eleanor's death, discussing the best methods, the timing, how to make it look like an accident." His hands clenched, crumpling the parchment. "He killed her. My own brother murdered my wife so he could take my throne, and used Captain Willem as his tool," the old woman added quietly. "Forced him into service. By threatening his family, just as he's forced dozens of others over the years. Your brother is a spider at the center of a web that extends through every level of court and beyond. These letters prove it. But getting them to people who can act on them without being killed first." She shook her head. "That's the challenge." The king looked up from the letters, his eyes finding Katerina's. "We go to the castle, tonight. While they think I'm dead or running, we find someone I trust, the captain. Of the guard, perhaps, or the chief justice. And we give them this evidence. We expose the conspiracy before it can destroy what's left of the kingdom." "That's suicide," Katerina said flatly. "The castle will be full of your brother's people. The moment you're seen, the moment I'm seen, I force the issue," the king interrupted. "I make them act publicly instead of in shadows, because right now they still need to maintain the fiction of legitimacy. They need me to die tragically or be declared incompetent. If I walk into court alive and accusing my brother of regicide, they'll have to respond, and that response will reveal them." It was insane. It was brilliant. It was almost certainly going to get them both killed. But Katerina looked at the letters in the king's hands, evidence that could finally bring justice for a murdered queen, and she knew they had no choice. "Together," she said simply. The king smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it reached his eyes. "Together." The old woman moved toward them, pressing something into Katerina's hands, a small silver pendant on a chain. This was Eleanor's. She wore it always. "If you survive, if you expose the conspiracy and live to tell the tale, I want you to have it. As thanks for finishing what she started. For being brave when it mattered most." Katerina closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling the weight of a dead queen's faith settle onto her shoulders like a mantle she hadn't asked for but would carry anyway. Because sometimes courage wasn't about never being afraid. Sometimes it was about being terrified and moving forward despite the fear. They left the chapel as evening shadows lengthened across the forest. Two people who'd saved each other's lives multiple times in a single impossible day, heading toward a confrontation that would either save a kingdom or destroy them both. And for the first time in 3 years, Katerina felt something other than guilt burning in her chest. It felt like purpose. It felt like redemption. It felt like the moment before a scream that could change everything. Katerina's scars will never fade. The black stains on her face are permanent reminders of the price she paid for 3 years of silence. But perhaps the deeper scars, the ones carved into her soul by guilt and fear, finally have a chance to heal. She learned what so many of us forget, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite the terror that paralyzes us. For 3 years, she ran from the moment she froze in the forest. But when the king needed her, when justice for a murdered queen hung in the balance, she found the strength to stop running and start fighting. Sometimes redemption doesn't erase our failures. It transforms them into the foundation for who we become next. What would you have done in that forest 3 years ago? Would you have screamed, knowing it might cost you your life? And when your family disfigured you to protect themselves, would you have found it in your heart to understand their fear, or would the betrayal have destroyed you completely? The truth Katerina discovered is one we all must face eventually. The people we trust can hurt us in ways strangers never could, and the line between victim and survivor is crossed not when the pain stops, but when we decide the pain will no longer define us. She walked into that castle beside a broken king, carrying letters that would tear a kingdom apart, wearing scars that told a story of both cruelty and resilience. And in doing so, she proved that even the most ordinary person, a scarred farm girl who once froze in fear, can become extraordinary when they finally find their voice and refuse to be silenced. The real question isn't whether we'll face moments that test us. We will. The question is whether we'll let those moments destroy us, or whether we'll let them reveal the strength we never knew we had. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own moments of silence and courage, I invite you to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to find your voice. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the complicated beauty of being human. And leave a comment telling me, what would you have done in Katerina's place? Your answer might surprise you. Until next time, remember that every scar tells a story, and sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we thought we'd never have the courage to tell.